So I want to move from generally speaking about communication, what we know about communication or in organizations, and the importance of recognizing the audience, nonverbals, cultural, and individual differences in communication, and start talking about individual communication skills. So how do we improve our communication skills? So this effectively, again, is for all types of communication, but it's probably most specifically about how to increase our own individual communication skills. So number one, we want to use simple, clear language. Keep it simple is basically what this is that a lot of times in an effort to make things sound more complex, we often use more complex language. The simpler it is, the clearer it is, the better it is likely to be understood and incorporated into the understanding of the person that's receiving the message. We want to become an active and attentive listener. So a lot of us tend to talk but not listen. So we need to be making sure that when we communicate, it's a two-way channel where we're communicating, but we're also listening to the other person put it into their own words and ask questions. And if they're communicating, we want to be an active, attentive listener. In other words, we want to role model what we would expect someone to be doing when we're talking. We want to gauge the flow of information through the discussion. Are we talking too much or too little? We want to give and receive feedback. So basically, we want to be open to questions of someone saying, could you explain that in a different way? And not be reactive or negative, but go, okay, let me think of another way I could communicate it. Let me think of a different example. But we also want to give feedback if necessary. Hey, let me know what you're thinking here. Am I understanding? Can you put it back in your own words? We want to be a supportive communicator, and that's what basically 1 through 4 is about. We want to be supportive. We want to make sure that we make it clear to the person that's receiving the message that we're communicating that we are trying to make sure that they understand and that we are supportive of the process. Finally, on top of all this, whenever possible, we do also want to use inspirational communication tactics. In other words, we don't want to be dry and boring. We want to be engaging, both verbal and nonverbal. We want to be basically excited about what we're communicating. We want to sound like we have some passion. People typically determine the value of the information, again, by how the person communicates it. When someone communicates the exact same information in a very dry and boring manner, where they do not vary their vocal tone at all, and they simply speak the words in a normal pace that never gets faster and never gets slower. That same information is going to be a lot more dynamic if someone's passionate about it and they're communicating in a style of voice that sometimes speeds up and sometimes slows down and makes major points, but also stops and considers, is this message being understood? So those inspirational communication tactics, again, it's easy to identify someone that is not inspirational in how they communicate. But at the same time, we need to develop that in our own skill set. So let's talk about each one of these a little bit in process. So the first one was, of course, use simple and clear language. Using needlessly formal language imposes a serious barrier to communication in all but the most experts in that field. If we're communicating to, if the purpose of our communication is to show that we are of a similar background and a similar knowledge, jargon makes sense. But for the most part, that specialized language used by a particular group, i.e. professional people within a profession, should definitely be careful about being used outside. So for example, in the field of IO psychology, which is of course industrial organizational, that's jargon. If you go up to someone that knows industrial organizational psychology and say, I'm an IO, they know exactly what you're talking about. If you say it to someone with a business background, they have no idea what you're talking about. We often, for example, also talk about KSAOs. So again, let's take a look at this. IOs should evaluate their experiences with KSAOs, with PAs, and be on the lookout for hypos. So what exactly does that mean? So again, PAs are primary assessors. There's other terms that can be for. Hypos is high-performing organizational members, and KSAOs is knowledge, skills, abilities, and others. So again, we want to be careful that we often create jargon to make communication easier with people that know what we're talking about. In other words, this small sentence here is actually a lot more packed for someone that knows what all this means. In other words, if I had to read it out completely, it would be industrial organizational psychologists should evaluate their employers' knowledge, skills, abilities, and others that are relevant to the workforce with any of their primary decision makers and be on the lookout for those that are high performers. That's a much more complex sentence, but it's the same information. But if I'm communicating to someone that has not got a background in industrial organizational psychology, that second longer version would actually be the clearer language. We want to basically use the KISS principle, the basics principle of communicating, advising the message should be short and as simple as possible while not using jargon. So keep it short, keep it simple whenever possible. Skill 2, becoming an active listener. Tips for active listening include ask questions and put the speaker's ideas into your own words. And I'll often do this in my own calls. So if I'm interviewing someone to learn more about a role, for instance, that I do not have familiarity with. So let's say I'm interviewing someone for a nonprofit CEO president position. I will often listen to what they're telling me, and then I'll say, okay, what I heard you say, and I'll put it into my own words. In other words, how am I conceptualizing this idea? And a lot of times they'll go, actually, that's perfect. That's excellent. That's exactly what I meant. And sometimes they're like, no, that isn't what I meant. Here, and they'll give me some more information. So that helps me avoid jumping to conclusions or evaluating the speaker's remarks without actually checking first. It makes sure we understand another's ideas before we formulate our reply. And one of the ways that we can actually become more active listeners is the HURIER model, H-U-R-I-E-R. This is a conceptualization that describes effective listening as made up of the following 6 components: hearing, understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. Now, obviously, every time someone says something to us, we're probably not going to walk through all 6 steps, but we want to be aware that if we're not understanding, it's probably a failure in one of these 6 components. So let's just take a quick look at this model. So hearing, paying careful attention to what's being said. In other words, being in the moment, actually listening to their what's being communicated to you. Understanding, are we comprehending the message being sent? And this might be an opportunity where we need to stop someone and say, you just said I-O. What does that mean? To help understand. Remembering, so once we actually understand and have heard what has been communicated, can we recall it? In other words, are we encoding this into memory? We want to respond, replying to the sender, letting him know that we are paying attention. And sometimes this just might be eye contact, nodding along, or occasionally going, ah, yeah. Those little bit of verbal cues let someone know that you are listening. We then, once we've gotten the message and we've understood it, we want to evaluate it, not immediately passing judgment on the message being sent, but really think about what does this message mean and potentially putting it into our own words. And finally, interpreting, not reading anything into the message the sender is communicating, but really making sure, is this what you mean? That's the process that we want to follow. Another one of skills is to make sure we're not getting information overload. So again, the problem, too many messages reaching a person at once. So I often get this at work where I will sit down at the start of the day and there is 27 emails waiting for me or 35 emails, and all of them need me to attend a little bit. I tend to respond to those emails, but honestly, I'll be very honest, I tend to be very short and quick and task focused in those responses. Compared to if I'd got the exact same emails one every 15 minutes, I probably would have given a deeper response to each one. So some of the solutions is to kind of think about, if I'm getting too many messages, how is that affecting my communication? Some people in positions of power where they get a lot of messages may use gatekeepers. So basically the gatekeeper is the one receiving the messages and then prioritizing what are the messages that are absolutely important for that person to answer. Another one is to simply use queuing to present the messages in order or to basically prioritize. So one of the things I could be doing, and I do sometimes, is I quickly go through those emails and I categorize them into 3 groups. Things I can ignore, things that I need to respond to, but not immediately. And I'll often throw a little time on my calendar later in the day or the next day, respond to so-and-so's email, and emails that I have to respond to immediately. All of these are ways to avoid this information overload. So when systems are overloaded, distortions and omissions are likely resulting. And like I said, I often respond very short and task focused when I have too much information I'm responding to. So some strategies to avoid these problems is, again, redundancy, transmitting messages via multiple channels. And that might also be responding, but then also following up with the person. Hey, did you get my response? Did it make sense? And verifying, ensuring that messages have been received accurately by having them repeated back. So basically, again, both of these are about multiple ways of communicating back, but also making sure the message is heard. So we also talked about the use of feedback in improving communication skill. So Broadly speaking, if ideally we want basically 360-degree feedback on any message. We want that message to be responded to by everyone that's getting it, and we want feedback from everyone. And that's what 360-degree feedback means. I'm getting feedback on the message itself from those that are actually directing the message. So yes, that's what we want you to communicate. I'm getting feedback from my peers. Yes, I received the message and it makes sense. And I want to get feedback from the people that the message might have been intended to, especially if it's a direction, my direct reports. So basically, suggested systems are procedures that provide formal mechanisms to employees to present their ideas to the company. Corporate hotlines, telephone lines, staffing by experts, ready to answer employees, employee informal meetings, employee surveys. All of these are methods of collecting feedback in an organization. And if these aren't present, if there isn't a 360-degree feedback system, if there isn't the ability for individuals to basically contact issues within the organization. If there aren't these informal meetings, if there aren't employee surveys, generally the people that are involved start to feel like the only communication they get is directed communication, and they're not really valued. So this feedback loop on an individual level is an important part of communication, but it's also an important part of communication on a corporate or organizational level. We talked about supportive communication. So any communication that is accurate and honest and builds and enhances a relationship instead of jeopardizing them. So some of the things we want to think about is the difference between invalidating language and validating language. So invalidating language is that arouses negative feeling about one's self-worth. So if I'm having to communicate some negative bad news, if I'm having to communicate some feedback that someone needs to improve with work, I want to focus that work not on the individual, but on the task that they do. So that's validating language. Language that makes people feel recognized and accepted for who they are. So I'm not saying that you're not capable of doing this. In fact, I believe you can, but here's the behaviors that I need to see. We also want to look at conjunctive versus disjunctive statements. Conjunctive statements are statements that keep conversations going by connecting one speaker's remarks to another. So for instance, a conjunctive statement would be, hey, I'm really seeing a drop off in your performance. Your last two reports had a lot of errors. What do you think's going on, and how can we correct it? What are your thoughts on how we can make sure those reports are back to where they need to be? A disjunctive statement is statements that are disconnected from the previous statement and tend to bring a conversation to a close. I need you to improve your reports. That's it. Just get them better. That's a disjunctive statement. It really doesn't invite conversation. So whenever possible, we want to validate and we want to have conjunctive statements. Not just because it makes the person feel better, but also it's more likely to result in behavioral change. Research has found that invalidating language that basically blames the person and their self-worth and basically just gives commands with no ability for the person to empower or suggest how things can be improved is much less likely to result in any kind of positive behavioral change. Information that is being given with validating language and conjunctive statements is much more likely to result in positive change. And again, if the goal of communication is to successfully communicate the information in a way that the user understands and then utilizes, we want validating and conjunctive statements. And finally, that last one is the big one, inspirational communication. We want to project confidence and power with emotion-provoking words. Say bonding with customers versus being friendly. So again, we want to think about how do we not only make the communication clear, but also make it empowering to the person. So being friendly, how am I supposed to be friendly? Are you telling me to smile more? However, bonding with customers might make a little more sense. We also want to be credible when we talk. So for example, if I was trying to tell someone they needed to be more friendly with customers, I would first tell them, I want to talk about ways that you could bond with the customers more, to where their perception is that you're there for their side. And research has found that customers are much more likely to come back to an organization when they feel this feeling of bonding with the actual employees. Pitch your message to the listener. So again, instead of saying you have to do this, I'm pitching here's why you should do this and why you should care about doing it. We want to cut through the clutter, and we also want to use front-loaded messages. And what a front-loaded message means is we want to be clear what we're talking about. So I don't want someone guessing what the conversation is about. I want them to understand we're talking about how you interact with customers, but we want to look at how this is a problem, and we want to empower you to do better. That's a front-loaded message, and then start the conversation. A non-front-loaded message would be a situation where the person doesn't even know, am I getting yelled at? Am I doing good? Am I doing bad? We want to make it clear why we're communicating. So all of these are going to help us individually. All 6 of these will basically result in both better organizational communication, but also individual communication. Also, if we're being asked to diagnose a problem within an organization, I would look at these 6. Is there issues with how people are inspirationally communicating? Are there issues with how they're getting feedback? Is there issues on how they're on the various other aspects of that communication? So hopefully this gives you a really good overview of communication. I definitely suggest you read the chapter as well, as there's always going to be, it's another source, it's another medium, if you will, of communication, but it's also going to come at these topics in a little bit of a different framework. I mainly try to give you just the basic idea and then hopefully some examples that you can build on in these lectures. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to go onto Canvas and the discussion board, and I'll be checking that regularly. And otherwise, I'll see you next week.